Welcome to episode 101 of the Necronama.com. When you have two professors on your show, 101 is the perfect number for the episode. I am James Sabata, horror author, screenwriter, co-host of the podcast you're listening to right now, and I feel BACURAU's pain. People have been trying to make me disappear for years.
And I am Don Guillory, author, historian, educator, co-host of this podcast, and I'm still processing this movie and still processing a lot of stuff, but unfortunately, because of shitty people like Bolsonaro, I cannot process a ticket to Brazil right now.
It's so weird how much the world is changing based on who's in charge of which country right now. It's just fascinating to me how people can't come to America, certain people, when one president's in charge. And then, you know, we're sort of changing that. But every country is kind of doing their own thing. And like when you say that, if the next election in Brazil changes, there's a good shot that changes. And I'm absolutely fascinated by how this has become well, this one person thinks this way, so this is what our whole country's fucking doing. And it's pissing me off. Anyway, our guest today is Dr. Andrew Scahill. Welcome to the show, man.
Hey, thank you for having. Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you guys about this one.
I can't say enough good things about this film. If I had gone in and you were like, oh, it's pretty much an updated Western that takes place in Brazil, I would have been like, cool. And in my head, I'd be like, well, never watching that, but okay. And this is currently sitting at my second favorite movie of the year. Mortuary Collection is like the best anthology I've seen in decades. So it's going to be really hard for anything to touch that because anthologies are just like my favorite thing. But no, this film just blew me away. It was so good. And one character in particular, Lunga, we'll come back to Lunga a lot, but oh my God, I love Lunga. And I haven't stopped thinking about this film. So thank you for making me watch it.
And I'm going to second that because this would have been, I would have completely missed this one if you hadn't said that this is the movie that you wanted to see, because I love foreign horror. I mean, I love horror itself, but I like the way that horror films look from another lens, you know, because of culture, because of histories, because of whatever circumstances are going, you know, whatever political issues are being represented. So it's just one of those things where, again, for a lot of people, they need to get past it has subtitles.
Right.
You know, get past that shit, because you're going to miss out on some great films because they don't get a wide release in the United States, or they don't get promoted here. I mean, this was a film that was, I believe, was joint produced, you know, with Brazilian and French production companies. So it was going to have its reach abroad, or at least not abroad for them, but at least in Latin America and in parts of Europe. But I think we, as an American audience, we're missing out on so much because of this stupid, and I'm going to say it's stupid, somebody's going to get mad at me, but this stupid adherence to, I need to hear it in my own language. No, you don't. I mean, you can have a silent horror movie, and a lot of the tropes, a lot of the universalities are still going to be there that can make you think, can make you contemplate the film beyond the 90, 120, 3 hours, that 120 minutes, 3 hours that you might be watching it. And again, I've got to thank you for doing this because, one, it answered one of my questions of, you know, whatever happened to Sonia Braga? Like, it's like, I remember her in some movies as a kid, and I saw her and I was like, holy shit, she's still around. And of course, newcomers who happen to be, you know, politically active, like Silverio Pereira in this film, and how important it is to have art and history combined to give somebody, history and politics combined to give someone an outlook on problems that they probably hadn't considered themselves, that people are actually going through. I mean, it's a fictional representation, but things that people are going through that they might not be considering because it's not something that's taking place in their own backyard. So again, thank you for getting us to talk about this film.
Absolutely. And I think that was a big part of like my interest in calling attention to this film, is because I feel like not enough people outside of Brazil, outside of Latin America, are going to see this film. And I think that's a shame. We all three, it sounds like, really loved it, but it also, we should say, meant that it won the at Cannes Film Festival, won the Grand Jury Prize for the Palme d'Or. So it's been recognized. We are just not kind of seeing the recognition here in the States.
I'm sure we will when Hollywood decides to remake it.
Could you imagine? Like, I guess that's my other thing too about, you're telling people, don't worry about the subtitles, but there's a sense too in which you're not going to get everything. There are cultural nuances of this film that I don't get, but I find that fascinating. You know what I mean? It is a world that exists outside of my experience, and to be able to kind of see a different view, a different way of living was really fascinating to me.
Well, that's one of the things I liked most about it, because it does resonate with me as an American, seeing corrupt politicians or just, a community having to take care of itself because no one else will help them. Mm-hmm. And that part does resonate with me. But then like the daily life, obviously there are many differences with my daily life,
Yeah.
And for me, I'm the kind of person where I'm like, oh, wow, this one little thing really sticks out to me. I got to go read about it now,
Mm-hmm.
And so I love stuff like this, but I totally get why it's a turnoff for other people at the same time. So it's not like the same to me as me telling you have to watch Train to Busan in Korean and you got to do it correctly, like that's a film you can understand everything that's going on, but I do like how culturally relevant to where they are this film is, because it does give you that view of, hey, there's life outside of the US, and I feel like a lot of people in my life don't know that.
Mm-hmm. You tell people, there are Americans in this film. If you need that sort of, cipher for yourself, they're terrible and you'll want them to die. But there are Americans in this film. They speak English.
I have a couple family members that might root for them, so I don't know.
Right. It's,
I know we're a little late into this already, but why don't you tell our listeners about yourself and all that good stuff?
I'm an assistant professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, in the English department, and I specialize in film, in particular the horror genre. I write a lot about youth representation in horror, so monstrous children, evil children, that sort of thing. But overall, I see a lot of my career has been focused on images of youthful rebellion in film, which is one of the things that really got me interested in this film. So I like seeing how generational conflict is represented in film, and that's been a lot of my focus the last decade of my career.
Cool. And you have a book. I'm going to mess up the title. So
sure. It's called The Revolting Child in Horror Cinema, let me see if I get this right, Youth Rebellion and Queer Spectatorship. So one of the things I do is I look at the types of evil children that we see in films, and I read them as representative of anxiety around queer youth. So like evil children tend to be gender non-normative, right? Evil girls tend to be out of control bodies, and evil boys tend to be sullen and withdrawn. But also the types of evil children are like the kid who has a secret, the kid who becomes a monster in adolescence, and we have to call upon the church to cure them. So in a lot of ways, they speak to our anxiety about a queer childhood that looks alien to the kind of normative family structure.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so that's been fun. But my next project, a little bit of a departure for me, but still kind of interested in this idea of rebellion, is looking at the representation of DC on film as a sort of symbolic sort of site in which we deal with a lot of our global anxieties through representing this city in different ways.
Can you give me an example of that? Like, you don't have to get too into your book if you don't want to, but
Yeah. So looking at like the types of stories we tell about DC, be it the kind of American innocent narrative of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, about a pure individual who goes and fights against the corruption of DC, or the spout of films in which DC is invaded, particularly the White House. I call this the breached fortress film, right? That imagines DC as this last line of defense. And what's interesting about DC, and I lived there for a bit while I taught at Georgetown, is that it is one of the few cities that their skyline is not industry, right? It's not skyscrapers or bridges, it's monuments. And its primary function is to be symbolic. And so for that reason, kind of looking at its representation on film is really kind of evocative.
I have never even considered that. That's fantastic.
But no one else has read
what
this.
prompted that, though, as far as you studying that?
It was me living in DC, and when I was teaching at Georgetown, my office window actually looked down upon the Dolan Cathedral, which is the first cathedral we see in The Exorcist that was desecrated. And so I saw that like Exorcist setting all the time. I started writing a piece about The Exorcist, and it just got me really kind of diving into DC's history, and in particularly looking at Georgetown's history is strangely kind of commensurate with the narrative of The Exorcist. It used to be an all African-American community, and through gentrification policies, the government kind of sort of disenfranchised all of those citizens and moved them. And here The Exorcist is this movie about an African demon which invades the body of a white girl, and we need to call upon the church to kind of ritually evacuate that person from her body. And so reading the history of Georgetown against the film is kind of where that piece came from. And that just got me thinking overall about how we use DC as a setting in film.
I love that so much. And I know we kind of talked about it before we started recording, but like I haven't been able to stop thinking about this since you first mentioned this. And I don't know, the whole thing is fascinating to me. I think we could do a whole episode on this, like it's...
Well, yeah, you could do a whole episode.
So good.
On like the sort of political thriller, right, of the 1970s is so interesting. Or, I'm teaching a class on Hitchcock right now, and we just did Strangers on a Train, which is a really interesting film about DC and queerness and secrecy, So all of those things are really fascinating to me.
That's great.
Yeah.
So I suppose we'll jump into the back into the BACURAU. I guess we've already been talking about it, but you've sort of hit this. But like overall, what made you pick this film to come here, other than just not enough people had seen it? Like what really hit you with it?
I think from the outset, I love genres and I love genre mixing. And I think this is one of the most interesting examples of genre mixing that I've seen in cinema. Just how it uses the tropes of both the Western and the science fiction film, which points out what has always been true, which is that like the Western and the alien invasion film are really the same movie. It just depends on which side you're on. It is, if it's the Western, you're the advanced civilization and you're stealing land from people because they're savage. But in the alien invasion film, here comes a more advanced race coming to take your land and you're the savages, right? And you need to defend your homestead. And what this film does to combine those two is really fascinating. This idea that one man's Western is another man's invasion movie. And I found that this film kind of speaking to that in a more concrete way than any other film I've seen. So that was one thing that really struck me. And then, I think a lot about writing about the horror genre and how often it's used as a very conservative genre because it's so often about the sort of normative life being threatened by something outside it and something other to it. But there's this really strong potential in the genre to be the mouthpiece of the disenfranchised and talking about what it means to be under the foot of something large and monstrous and grotesque. And I think this film really capitalizes on the progressive potential of horror to speak to those issues.
Yeah. All right, that's it. I'm quitting the show, and Dr. Scahill will be taking my place. It was fun. I made it over 100 episodes.
That's a good run.
No, I love that. That's so great. Wow.
Well, I think we're having a moment in horror right now, right? And Jordan Peele's, I think, maybe the most prominent example of this, but like, what happens when you get minorities in the director's chair able to make these films is that you get a different brand of horror. It's not so much about the status quo being threatened by abnormality. It's about like, what does it mean to be a minority, right? In a system that is antagonistic towards you. And I think it's just a really exciting time for horror,
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
I think one of the because this is an argument that I raised, and not everybody's going to agree with it, but my argument is that Birth of a Nation is the first feature-length horror film.
Yeah.
And it's basically from the same standpoint or same discussion that you're having with respect to perspective,
right?
With Westerns or with invasion films. And it's the whole idea of one group is seeing this film as a rallying cry to save America, to do something else. And then there's another group that sees the film as, holy shit, this is the worst possible thing that somebody could make, because it's changing what history was, but then two, it's ramping up hysteria and hate crimes and all these things that are there. Not to mention, what's actually on film and how they're doing that. And I think by increasing the amount of people and diversifying, I shouldn't even say diversifying, because diversity is about numbers. Becoming more inclusive about the stories that you're telling allows the audience, not just the people that are telling the story, but allows the audience to see the different types of fear that are out there. But it's great to see that, because especially when you direct it towards this film, you're now seeing it from the vantage point of, if we were to make it, a typical U.S. Western, you're taking it from the perspective of either Mexicans or indigenous peoples.
So it's interesting, because that was one of the questions I was asked in my interview when I interviewed for this position at Denver. It is, would you teach Birth of a Nation? Like, should you teach Birth of a Nation in a history course? And I said, I think you should. I think, of course you should, but you should teach it for what it is, which is a piece of propaganda, right? Or teach it as historical revisionism, or teach it as a horror film. Absolutely. And then, but also, talk about Oscar Michaud and some of the sort of counter narratives that were attempted to be produced during the time as well. But yeah, I think absolutely. I think that's a really great example of horror used as a mouthpiece for the status quo. And a lot of genre, we have this conversation about genre a lot. Like, is genre itself inherently conservative? Because it tends to happen upon predictable narrative lines. It, in the sort of mass-produced versions, it doesn't really question status quos. It's often about the comfort of predictability and the comfort of closure. But when you get to certain spats of horror, like the thriller, or these kinds of more socially conscious, it is a different type of film that isn't about comfort, isn't about closure. And those are the ones I tend to be drawn towards.
Carpenter has this theory of the left wing and right wing of horror. And the right wing basically comes down to something out there is trying to get us. And the left wing basically comes down to there's a problem within us and we need to solve it. And I mean, if you make politics really, really basic, I feel like a lot of the laws that each side pushes follows that. Like, the right side is very much something's out there coming to get me. So immigration, I need guns, fear, blah, 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 blah. And then there's a problem inside. We need to solve it. Universal health care or education or whatever. And I'm not saying it completely follows that. It definitely does not. I'm saying bare basics, right? But like, what I love about that is I think it kind of hits that is horror conservative thing you were just talking about, because I feel like we're getting way more of the horror within and the need to fix it or be eaten by it, right? And then you have like the slasher years where everything was super conservative. Like, I've repeatedly talked about Jason as the angel of death,
I'd be curious to have a conversation with you about that, because I actually don't agree with the slasher being inherently conservative. I think it expresses the anxiety of a younger generation having to pay for the mistakes that their parents made. The Vietnam War, the wrecked economy, it's always young bodies dying for the previous generation's mistakes.
I definitely want to have that conversation. We can do it. We can do it on here for everyone to hear, or alone. I don't care, but I want to have this conversation.
I'll come back to talk about the slasher. I love talking about this, and I'm an advocate for thinking about the progressive potential of the slasher. Actually,
I love that. That sounds great.
It's also one of the few genres that forces the presumed young male spectator to identify with the body of a female and to turn the tables on a patriarchal villain.
This is why I'm quitting the show. See? So No, I love that.
Great example of like if we think about horror as like an often conservative genre, certainly we think of the sci-fi invasion film as a conservative genre and the Western as a conservative genre. So really it's taking, and the war film, right? It's taking, I would argue, some of the most conservative leaning genres and making them this really amazing progressive opus.
So let's talk about Bacurau in that way. Just even the opening. I'm going to kind of take this in a different way, but we're coming back to this. The way the characters are each constructed throughout the opening throws you off the rest of the film. Like, I went into this and I thought this is going to be a collection of crazy characters, and I'm like, where are their arcs going? And no, the character is Bacurau. It is the community. It is the town. And I loved that so much more than if each of these people had a full storyline. But I also thought they had enough that it made them all individual. It showed their role in that society, which is huge.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this harkens back a lot to neo-realist filmmaking, using real actors or people that aren't typically glamorous, using real locations, not having a central protagonist is kind of a classic of like communist cinema. And so it's really kind of utilizing a lot of those foundational techniques of neo-realism.
But I thought it also, it instantly turns the tables on the genres we expect. Westerns are always that one person that's the savior that's come to save the town. Yeah, and it's always somebody from out of town.
Yeah.
It's always the newcomer. And this is, fuck the newcomer, they're the bad guys.
Did you guys notice there's a shot that has what's his name, Tony Jr., the terrible politician? There's a shot in which he's in the middle of the town square and it pulls back on him on a crane, which is a quote of High Noon, which I thought was really, really interesting, how it's using that really classic shot from the Western to kind of invert it in a way.
My favorite Western is The Quick and the Dead, and my reason is because it was a female lead. Because my entire life, my dad made me watch every single fucking John Wayne film that was ever made. And I've seen Rio Lobo like 200,000 times for no fucking reason. And I've seen McClintock too many times to count. And I hate Westerns. Okay. I hate them because I hate this repetitive, here comes the white guy to save us all, and so that's my favorite because I know it would piss him off. But when you talk like that shot that pulls back, like that's instantly where I was, because The Quick and the Dead does it like, I don't even know, 20 times in the film.
Right.
And then I was like, if Bacurau explodes, this is going to be so fucking terrible. Please don't do that.
Absolutely.
No, but so I was interested, like, do you guys watch other Westerns or have you in your life, and what do you think of them?
I also hate the Western. You know what I mean? I think it's a genre that I deeply dislike ideologically, but I like it when it's deconstructed well. So there's a great film that I teach called The Keeping Room, which is a great feminist Western. You should actually check it out if you like The Quick and the Dead.
The ones that I've watched, because I kind of had the same situation with my father where he just loved Westerns, and and he keeps his TV, like even now, he keeps it on the Western Channel with the TV shows, the movies, and for him, it's more like it reminds him of when he was growing up. That was what was on TV. So kind of like he has that romanticism. But I did not like any Westerns until probably like the Young Guns movies came out. So like the second one, and then there was one from, gosh, what was it? It was one of those HBO movies called The Cherokee Kid with Sinbad. And then there was another good one. It was Hell or High Water. It's a modern Western.
That was recent, yeah.
Yeah. And it was one of those things where I didn't realize it was a Western because it was so well done and so well paced. Right. I didn't realize it was a Western because I'm thinking it's a bank robbery movie. It's a bank heist movie. Right. Then I get halfway home like, son of a bitch, you guys, you watched a Western and did not complain about it.
Fooled you. Yeah. I mean, I like True Grit, but more like for the performances than I really for the, I don't know. I just don't mythologize that history, so it doesn't really do much for me.
So this is what's interesting to me. I was expecting you both to say you don't like Westerns, and yet we all love this film.
Uh-huh.
And I think that that's exactly why, because it removes that thing that I'm assuming the three of us don't like.
Right.
So, I mean, I know it's the thing I hate, but I'll assume you guys have the same thing. And that's one of the things I love most about this. I feel like it did it with every genre that it touches. It twisted all the genres, and it just made its own thing. And I love this.
Absolutely. So you talked about the opening of the film. Can we talk about like when we enter the village, which I think is really fascinating. I'm wondering if you guys got the same vibe that it represents the village named BACURAU as a type of utopia. Is that also the vibe you guys got?
I can see that because that opening, the sign it says, if you go BACURAU, if you go in peace. I was immediately set up to think, okay, this is a place that's without class, without race, without gender, got all these things going on. And then somebody's going to come in and fuck it up. That's going to be one of those things that I can't remember what the movie was. It was like Population 423 or something. I can't remember the name of the movie, but they kind of had the same situation where it was this very small town. And when someone new came, it was going to upset the balance of the town. So someone had to die. Expecting that same type of thing. Like, you got the young lady and the guy who's carrying water. I'm like, okay, somebody's going back. And then you see the funeral, and I'm thinking, like, son of a bitch, it's going to do the same thing. But I didn't, I was immediately set up. I'm like, oh shit, this is going a completely different direction than I was thinking, because I was looking for it to be this little town in the back country where that's apolitical, is inclusive, is represented. People take care of each other, and somebody in there doesn't like it and they're going to upset the balance or whatever.
Right. Yeah, I'm just thinking about, that you mentioned the funeral, that everyone in the town seems to participate in the funeral, and it's intergenerational, as you mentioned, it's multiracial. There seems to be no distinct divisions. If anything, the culture feels matrilineal, which and a kind of matriarchal culture, which is fascinating. And even like the town kook is kind of integrated pretty well into the community. And the funeral itself was so, I don't know how to describe it. In a different film, this would maybe feel like a cult, but it felt comfortable here.
It just felt like one big family. And even at the funeral when they were eulogizing, there was that one moment where I wrote it down. It was like, BACURAU has it was Carmelita's funeral, and basically talking about how she had, BACURAU and families had people all around the world, doctors, lawyers, politicians, scientists. So they went through all this stuff. And said all kinds of children came from here, but no thieves. And I was thinking, I was like, all right, this is a town that is proud of their heritage, proud of their identity, and also proud that everyone has made it. I mean, as far as what they've determined making it means, which is you provided something for people. You've done something good for people. You haven't done things you haven't taken shortcuts.
They even seem to kind of cook meals together, which is really, really kind of like fascinating. And all of these sort of segments of the culture, which we would expect to be ostracized from it, like sex work, is integrated into the community.
Yeah, because it serves a function. It's just one of those things that I'm glad you brought that up, because when we were talking earlier, you talked about the positive representation of sex work, where people are not demeaned for being in it.
Right.
It's kind of like, well, fuck it. They're providing a service. And it makes you look at the way that sex work is treated in this country, to where, their lives are valued as less. Or if they get sexually assaulted, it's like, well, that's your line of work. I can't really take your word for it.
Right.
Or just the way that people regard them as somehow you're subhuman or you're trash or any number of, pejoratives that somebody would apply, as opposed to you are providing a service no different than anyone else. And let's face it, who honestly gets hurt in this situation? If we're going in just as if this is any type of transaction, whether this is a male sex worker, female sex worker, there is an agreement. There is a transfer of funds. There is a transfer of service. and then you go about your way. And I love the way that it's captured in this film, because it's not treated as you pointed out, it's not treated as a taboo. It's treated as it's no different than the clinic. It's treated no differently as a service.
Yes, and it speaks to kind of what we say often, is that you're selling your body for labor, just as a sort of construction worker would sell their body for labor, right? It is your time and your body.
I've always enjoyed that argument. I think that sums it up so well. And I like that you just compared it to construction work, because construction takes a huge toll on you.
Absolutely.
And people can't do it their whole lives. You do it while you're young and while you're able, and at some point your back can't handle the ladders and everything else, you know?
Absolutely.
I mean, I think that's a really tight correlation there to sex work.
Right. And no one gets injured on the construction side and have people say, well, what did you expect being in that line of work, right?
Yeah, I think you'd get punched for that.
Right. There's also another interesting feature of this, which isn't kind of really explained in the diegesis of the film, which is that there's some substance, some pill that they take when sort of woman comes back to visit her village. That's never really kind of explained what it is. We imagine it's some sort of psychedelic potentially, but it's set up in contrast with these pharmaceuticals that get delivered to the village.
I thought that was interesting solely because we don't get to know what it is because we're not part of the culture.
Yes. And that's what I found really fascinating about this film, is that it's not really written for me, right? It's not that I went online and kind of like looked into it and kind of see what these things are about. But it speaks to some kind of like cultural tradition that I don't really have access to as an outsider. And I find that really fascinating.
Definitely. What did you make of that, Don?
Well, for me, it was one of those things, especially when Tony Jr. brings the medication or the expired medication, and the town doctor's like, if you want to take this shit, take it. I'm telling you, don't, because this is what will happen to you. But it also becomes that familiarity, because not that I grew up in these areas, but I have family who grew up in these areas where there happened to be a local, whether you want to call it a medicine woman or medicine man. I mean, as far as the equivalent, as far as what we would deem those people. But you would have people who were healers in parts of the South, or especially in parts of Louisiana, where you went to them if you were having an issue. Like, I'm having some issues with my stomach. Oh, let me mix this shit up for you, and that, take this and you'll be okay. And I think it becomes an issue of, you have the foreign versus the familiar.
Yeah.
So they're familiar with these types of drugs. And just to make a even better comparison, in places like Colombia, Ecuador, and Bolivia, you have people and Peru for that matter, you have people farmers especially, who use coca leaves. They chew them to increase their blood flow while they're working in the fields or working in the mountains, because of the elevations that they're working at. A lot of those people won't take some medications because it's like, this is what we're familiar with. This is what works for us. Don't give me that pill. I can chew the coca leaf. So you see how there's this understanding of what the medicine is going to do, or what the plant is going to do for them. And you know what? I don't want your shit from the outside. I don't know what's in it. I don't know what you're trying to do, especially when Tony Jr. brings that stuff. I don't know what you're trying to do by bringing this.
Right.
So it could be something that's to hurt me as opposed to help me.
Right, and Carmelita says that, beware of this stuff. It's actually just a sort of sedative, right? It's something to, like a Xanax, like it's designed to make you complacent. And I think one way to read this film and its conflict between like the local and the global is to think of these invading forces as cinema from other nations, particularly, industrialized nations, and this local kind of pill that they all take as local homegrown cinema, right? And because we often talk about like the escapist nature of particularly Hollywood cinema, is that it pacifies people, right? It simplifies, it rewrites history. And so I think one way to think of this film is just a sort of warning about what you consume, and to sort of amplify the power of local cinema.
Wow. This is the part where I make a joke about quitting the show again.
Well,
I was waiting. I was like,
I tend to think that like a lot of movies are just movies about movies, and this one in particular, since it's so much about an inability to be seen, right, by the global community, where BACURAU literally gets erased from Google Maps, I can't help but think of it as a statement about cinema itself and the global marketplace.
I like that a lot.
I don't know if you guys know, there's a really strong history of like revolutionary cinema in Latin America, and particularly Brazil. That I pulled up a quote from Glauber Rocha, who's a really important Brazilian filmmaker. And he talks about third cinema, so cinema of the third world. And he says, third cinema understands this hunger that the majority of Europeans don't understand. They don't know where this hunger comes from. We know. We who make these sad and ugly films, these desperate films, where reason doesn't always possess the loudest voice, that hunger will not be cured by the planning of the cabinet, and that the strips of Technicolor will not hide but amplify its tumors. That said, only a culture of hunger, looking at its own structure, can rise above itself.
Wow.
That's a great way to look at it.
Right.
Yeah,
and he coined this term of like a cinema of hunger. He also sometimes calls it miserableism, but it is a sort of confrontational cinema that doesn't want to pacify, that doesn't want to give you escapism, that makes you want to look at the world as it is and therefore change it.
And I think that's one of the great things when it comes to, the power of film itself, because I didn't mention this to you, but one of the classes I teach is film as history. And that's why, with a film like Birth of a Nation, I always point out, like, that's the first horror film. That's the first feature-length horror film because of the way it works as far as what's put in it, what the narrative is, the absence of the counter-narrative, the way in which it's received publicly. But the idea that film itself can either satiate you, enrage you, educate you. It has so many different possibilities, right? Mm-hmm. So it's great to see, especially a film made by people from that background, not even the nation, but from that background, to talk about issues that other filmmakers, or at least major studios, are not talking about. And it's great to have that at an international level. When you're talking about colonialism or post-colonialism, neoliberalism, all these different things. Or you can have it domestically with respect to the United States. You can have it domestically where we, sit there and think about, Flint, Michigan, and think about the water crisis there, or the poisoning of the water there. Or we have indigenous filmmakers that are telling their own stories, as opposed to we're hearing not even a secondhand story, but we're hearing a story about indigenous people or marginalized people from a person not from that background or unfamiliar with that background that can't tell us what it's like, because then it becomes a thing of like, oh, Dances with Wolves is such a great movie. Not saying it isn't, but I mean, as far as like, you can't get to a lot of the core issues of what indigenous peoples have gone through, or even a film like Pocahontas, where it makes it a very romanticized version of what actually took place, when the real story is fucking horrific, just horrible. And I can't wait for my daughter to watch it, and I can just ruin the movie for her 5 minutes. Right. Just understanding, like, if someone from that background is telling you that story and saying, like, hey, this is actually what happened in our neighborhood, or this is what happened during the riots, or this is what happened, at whatever period it is, that person has a vested interest in telling that story and want people to understand what actually went into the history, the political situations, the political motivations, the social issues that get represented, to make sure that people don't forget. I mean, and that's the problem with a lot of movies, is they represent something that is easily forgettable. This movie is not easily forgettable at all.
Yeah, there's a cultural theorist named Spivak who writes "Can the Subaltern Speak?" And I think about that a lot with this movie, and subaltern being like the colonized, right? And so how does the colonized speak back to the colonizer? And one of the ways is like using their forms, their genres, let's say, and inverting it and mocking it and combining it with other genres, right? And I think we really see that in this film as a sort of speaking back to not just these genres, but American first world cinema at large.
And probably American imperialism at large.
Absolutely.
American imperialism, James? What are you talking about? and I'm glad that you brought that up, though. I mean, seriously, Because a lot of people think that imperialism comes down to showing up with warships or an army or invading or whatever, right? But imperialism comes in so many different ways, and some of those ways happens to be in the medium that you consume. So, or the media that is actually sent out into the world. And we may have talked about this on a previous episode. So for those of you who listen to every episode, my apologies. But, a television show like The Simpsons goes all around the world, and people assume that's what it's like in America. I mean, as far as like, that's the family dynamic, that's the work ethic, things like that. If a show like,
Homer does sum up our work ethic.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to dispute that, but that's not everybody, and even when you get into, let's say, cultural issues or minority representation or women or things like that, that gets shipped somewhere else, and people assume that is the reality that people have in America, where, I can't remember if it was when I was in China or somewhere else, but the assumption abroad was like, oh, because of the films, television that's consumed in a lot of these places, they assume that all Americans are rich, or Americans don't have any problems. Which again, if you got to hear it from another vantage point, from people who are marginalized, poor, or from depressed economic situation in their state, you're going to find out real fast, like, no, shit, they're not rich. Things are not okay. When you see some of the stuff that's on television, yeah, I mean, those TV shows are great, but they do not give the true representation of what America looks like.
One thing, I don't know if we've kind of gotten to this part yet about the film, but it is a film in which it seems like wealthy American and European citizens who can pay to basically have a town erased from the map and then systematically slaughter the people. And what I find really interesting is that these are pointedly not kind of military people, or not the people we would expect for this type of film. A lot of them are sort of sad and pathetic people, right? Who are living out some sort of racist fantasy.
Oh, and in so many ways. In so many ways.
Well, and for people who haven't seen it, like literally that's the plot. They've paid for this through Tony Jr., who's the corrupt politician, and Tony has basically sold them out. He's had the town erased, and now these people get to come there and literally hunt people in their town in a natural environment. And this is so similar to poaching and that whole rich people pay to. I'll just be a dick here. Donald Trump Jr. pays to go slaughter some animal, and then look what I did. I'm so cool. And so you have an interesting collection of people here, because you have like the grizzled. I don't remember his name. Who's the main
Michael.
guy? Thank you, Michael. He's kind of the grizzled guy that seems like he's done this a few times, and he takes it to a whole nother level, which we'll get to in a bit.
Yep.
But and then you have this rich couple, and they're just so, oh, this is a big thrill. Look at this great thing we get to do.
Is this the Eurotrash on bikes? Is that the one?
No, I was actually talking about the two that have sex in the field.
That's right.
But yeah, the Eurotrash on bikes too. I love that term. But like, they're fascinating to me because they come in and interact with these people. No one else does that. Yep. They come in, they want to go shop in the little place. They want to get to know you. They want to fucking see you up close. And that's so much worse to me. Like, not that anybody's good doing this, but that's a whole nother level of disconnect and not viewing others as human. Like, it's like getting as close to the lion as you can, and it upsets me so much.
And I was thinking Human Zoo when you brought that up, because that's what it turns into.
Well, absolutely.
It's like, oh, we can touch the animals before we kill them.
Absolutely. And I think that there's a really fascinating thing happening in here with that they all have these fantasies of this being a war, right? Or something with like equal forces. They have to use anachronistic weapons while at the same time they're using this hyper-modern surveillance system, right? To kind of do their kills. So kind of like poaching for rental. It's like that sort of fantasy of being I don't know, a more fair kind of war than what they're actually doing, which is slaughtering people.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I don't advocate for killing animals at all,
Right.
but like go out into the wild and wait for that lion that's hiding in shit staring at you, and then tell me how cool you are.
Right. But that happens, right? That they go with these kind of bow and arrow, but all the animals have been sedated and in these pens, right? And it's that fantasy of doing sort of more primitive man. Yeah.
It's actually why I find it even weirder when they post their trophy photos, because I'm like, all you're doing is saying that you went and shot some animal that's like the equivalent of being in an old folks home. Like that's not hunting. What are you doing? You know, like did you attack this tiger and break his neck yourself?
Right.
You know?
There's another man in this hunting group that has said like his wife divorced him and he wanted to kill her, but he just came here instead, right? And so this is sort of like sublimation of rage at people that they get to live out here. There's a lot of similarities to like Westworld, I would say, in this film.
You know, what's fascinating about Terry, the guy you're talking about, one line really drove it home for me. Like, he tells that whole story of, I wanted to kill my wife. I went to the mall and I couldn't do it. And I went to the park and I couldn't do it. And then he says, God gave me this chance.
Oh, God, that's just...
He's talking about purging it out of his system because the great white Jesus gave him this opportunity to be a real man and get that out of his system. Fuck you.
Right. Yes. So it's a real motley crew of people, and I like that they all have these very different motives for being there, and they're all disgusting in different ways.
Well, and then you have the people who are from Brazil, and they're also hunting, but they're from a different section.
They're from
which city were they from? Yeah.
Well, they said they were from Rio, but
okay.
I mean that's what they told the people in BACURAU. Was that we're from Rio, we're traveling, we're just we're motocrossing across the mountains or whatever the excuse that was that they gave. But yeah, when they get to the table with the other poachers, the people poachers, people hunters, horrible human beings that happen to be there, they have this great moment where they're arguing about the fact that the motorcyclists, I guess, were just supposed to be there to I guess report back or at least do some intel on the town, but they ended up killing two of the guys who went and returned some horses. And when they tried to explain themselves, it turns into this racial superiority complex situation where it's like, well, where are you guys from? Oh, we're from south of here. Oh, well, you're not white. My wife, the look she had on her face was like motherfuckers, and I just looked at her and because she's gone through that same type of thing within Latin America. There are lots of issues surrounding race. Some that are spoken about, some that aren't, where there are these racial hierarchies that people try to adhere to, or at least try to subjugate other people with. And the idea that these two people did not see themselves as aligned with the Brazilians that were there of various colors.
Right.
Did not see themselves aligned with them, but they saw themselves more aligned with these poachers, these colonizers, these imperialists that showed up. It was very telling about so many things within Latin American history, like from the genesis of Portugal, like colonizing the area that is now Brazil. But just the way that the other hunters decide, like, oh, well, you're less than us, even though you had a contract to be here. Fuck you. We're going to shoot you. And then they all fight over who got the kill so they can get points.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's like, well, they weren't white people. We can shoot them. It's like, you've got to be kidding me.
What did your wife think overall?
She loved it. I can't remember what movie she said it reminded her of, but she liked it from the standpoint of you showed people in Latin America. I mean, as diverse as Latin America is, but you showed that they wouldn't become victims. Mm-hmm. Where in a lot of movies like this, mm-hmm. even if it's Brazilian on Brazilian or Mexican on Mexican or whatever, it's more about showing how somebody becomes victimized as opposed to this when it shows how they become empowered through that solidarity.
Yeah. And it's really interesting. In the town of BACURAU, there is a museum, which I found really interesting because it's such a sort of insular community, right? It's not a tourism town. But you find out later in the film that the townspeople have been through many violent revolutions, right? And so they are, in a sense, prepared for this, which I really love how that kind of takes the tropes that you mentioned on it and really sort of inverts them.
When the travelers, the motocross people happen to come into town, I forget the young lady's name at the store, but when she offers them, oh, do you want some water? You want a beer? You want whatever? She asks them, like, have you gone to the museum yet? It almost, and seeing them and then going back, I'm thinking, like, do they know that some shit might be going down? And they would have warned people who come here not to mess with us because, I mean, it goes back to that sign, like, if you go in peace. Yeah. So if you're going to come here, don't start anything.
Yes, that's what I think the museum's there for. It's a really don't fuck with us museum, right?
Yes, absolutely. Like, that should be written on the sign. Don't fuck with us. But I loved that so much that she's like, have you been to the museum? Because that is not a normal question. Like, I've gone to a lot of small towns in Nebraska or wherever else in the Midwest, and no one has ever been like, did you go to the museum? Yeah. You know, like, it is such an, like, it fits in the conversation, but it is such a direct thing. And that's the only answer. It's 100% go in there, find out what happens.
Yeah. And I think it speaks to what we said earlier. Like, this is a town that knows and it chronicles its own history culturally, right?
Totally.
Yeah, because even that moment where the two gentlemen are riding off out of town, right? They're like, I mean, they've got checkpoints set up in the town. And again, this is one of those movies where it doesn't make sense. Well, I shouldn't say it doesn't make sense. It makes more sense after you watch the whole film. Because at first I'm thinking like, oh, well, they got a checkpoint because maybe they're doing some illegal shit. Maybe they're doing drug run. Because I'm even thinking like, oh, well, maybe the prostitution isn't allowed at the state, but this town is like, hey, we're going to let prostitutes run. And it's like, oh, well, we got to look out in case the police show up and bust us for drugs or bust us for our little market and they want to collect taxes on us. So I'm thinking like it's set up for all these different things. But then you realize the checkpoints are set up for outsiders. Yeah. And to let you know, hey, if somebody's coming here to do something, we need to be ready to fight back. We need to be ready to do something.
So my favorite character, Linga, just fascinates me. The fact that he was basically exiled, but the community is still okay with him. Like, my question to you guys, did I miss something here? Like, did he self-exile? Or like, were they like, you went too far, you gotta go? And now they're welcoming him back because that changes what I want to say later. So what did you guys take from that part first?
I wasn't clear.
Yeah, I don't know either. And maybe it's deliberately ambiguous.
Good. So it wasn't something I missed. It's interesting that it's ambiguous.
Because he's wanted by the state. So because there's that warning when the water delivery guy comes in saying, oh, you know, this guy, you know that he's wanted for something, right? But it's not clear if the town sent him away, like you brought up, whether the town sent him away and said, hey, just go into hiding until the shit blows over. Or if he took it upon himself to say, I'm going to go into hiding until all this blows over. Because I made us look bad, or I made my family look bad, or something.
Yeah, and I think that's more what I get from this because of the history of kind of this violent revolution in the country. There are people who are wanted by the law and supported by the community, and yet, you know, their presence would endanger the community.
Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and really fits the character as well.
Absolutely. Do you want to say a little bit about why you like Lingo?
The part that I like is, when all hell breaks loose.
Yes.
But no. So, number one, what's the actor's name, Don?
Silvero
Pereira.
Thank you. Okay, I didn't know if you would know as well. Anyway, he's super active in Brazilian politics as it is, and he's also transvestite. Is he fully transgender?
He makes a point not to identify as transgender. He is someone who performs as a woman or as a transvestite. So there's an interview I read with him, and he said that specifically.
Okay, very cool. But I like how it's in the film, and no one gives a shit. No one in the community at any point cares. And I think that's really cool. I like how that adds to the outsider effect of still being part of the community, but not, even in a community that doesn't seem to bring it up. Then you add in there's something so beautiful about this character. Even the first time you meet him, he's terrified, he's hungry, he's starving, and yet he's like, they fucked up my family. They fucked up my friends. Like, I got to go take care of this. And just when he walks in, like, you get that feeling from the town, like, oh shit. And yet they're also hopeful with him. And I think it's so neat how all of this is such a symbolic thing of not being identifiable.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we meet him. I'm pulling up the still where he says, "I'm stuck here like that fag Che Guevara, starving to death." But when we meet him, it's almost like Rapunzel in the Tower, which I find really interesting when they kind of come to call upon him. He is this sort of like exiled person who gets welcomed back into the community in crisis. I find that really fascinating.
I like that. Man. You're blowing my mind here. I'm going to have to watch this again.
And when we meet him, he looks more sort of cisgender male, right? And I don't know if you noticed, but when he comes back to the community, he has like a full like mullet haircut, a long sort of hair down to his back, and dressed almost like a samurai, which again is this weird sort of genre mixing that this film engages in.
Well, samurai has a lot to do with Westerns as well. So,
and, the samurai were Ronin, right? They were sort of like men without a nation who kind of roamed the countryside and looking for essentially, quests to keep them, fed. So I find that interesting that he is a sort of like Ronin, right? From this exile, from this community.
Man, there's so many layers to this. This is so good. But even, I'm just going to skip ahead to the part I love. Like, when all hell breaks loose, and he's literally hiding, like, in the museum, and he comes out and just fucking slaughters Terry and slaughters some other people. And I literally, like, jumped out of my seat, and I was like, fuck yeah, and I never have that full reaction, and I was so invested in him that I was just like, yes, plus Terry's a piece of shit. But it was so interesting to me at the same time, because Westerns, like I said, my dad was John Wayne everything, right? Westerns teach you that this native reaction of scalping or jumping out of things is terrible, and they're so savage. And Lunga literally, not that he's a Native American, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, totally.
Same sort of thing in this role. Only, again, we're seeing it from the other side. We're seeing somebody's invading your shit, and you're going to put up this fight. And I thought it was neat how and I know this isn't a Brazilian thing. This is a me thing watching it, but it's so reminiscent of that same thing. And just seeing it from the other side made me totally react that way.
Absolutely. Well, and this is like modern warfare, right? In an era of drone warfare and what have you, we have this sort of like removed from the actual site of conflict, and we think of it as so civilized, right? And so clean. But it's sort of disgusting in this film how clinical and cold that it is through technology.
Well, you look at Vietnam, like that's why America got their ass handed to them, right? Because we thought, oh, we have this technology, we're great. And then they hit us with the shit that works instead.
Right.
Because they're not going to get a disagreement from me on that
one. But there's something so good. Again, this goes back to not identifying Lunga in any way. Like, just these layers of character where he can be so, like, completely civilized walking into the town, and then he goes to war, and it's the direct opposite. And I feel like it really shows that these rich fucks on the other side never got there. They never took it seriously. They thought, this is a guaranteed win. So they're not as invested. They're not trying as hard. And they never hit that full moment of doing it. And that also really stuck out to me.
It also becomes a thing for them of they're more concerned with racking up points. Like these are basically the fish in a barrel. We're going to shoot, and I'm going to count how many I got. You're going to count how many you got. But no, I do like how you point out the juxtaposition between Lunga, when we're meeting him and how he's interacting with people. Yeah, he's like, people are shaking his hand and patting him on the back and all these things where it's kind of like, oh, welcome back. We met, that type of thing of like, oh, we love you. We're your family. Thank you for coming back. Like you didn't have to leave. I mean, that was kind of the sense that you got was, it wasn't really clear how long he was gone. I mean, it wasn't too long. I mean, it was just, it seems like it maybe have been maybe a week, if that, because, it seems like he's been holed up at that same place, just waiting for, shit to die down. But the juxtaposition between this man and his and the identity that he has within this town, and people understanding that he can be violent if provoked, and the chance that in the opportunity that is presented to him to become violent, and as well for everybody else in that town for that matter, they don't want to have to do it, but it's a necessity. It seems as though they all regret having to be pushed to that point, even when it's the older gentleman who's gardening. And I believe he had one of the sex workers with him, and it seems like they just got done having sex. He went back to his garden to check on his plants, and those people showed up to ambush him. But he and the woman they get rid of the two people that were there, but they asked this important question to the lady who gets shot, and they said, "Do you want to live or die?" That itself, I'm expecting. The way U.S. movies have conditioned you, you're thinking like, do you want to live or die? And she's like, I want to live. Oh, too bad. You're going to die. That's the way you're conditioned. I'm sitting there thinking like, these people don't want to have to do this. We're going to take this woman who's been shot. We're going to take her to the town doctor so she can be treated, taken care of, and hopefully recover. Because we are not, as what gets stated later, we're not savages. And that also begs the question, like, they're not the savages, but so many Westerns have conditioned us to see the non-main character or the people that are being attacked or whatever, to see the other as the savage, right? When the reality is the people that with the advanced technology, the foreigners that are invading, the ones who are doing this for fun, they're the real savages, because the people that they deemed as fucking savages several times are violent only to protect themselves when these people are choosing to be violent, choosing to play with these people's lives as if it's if it's bonus points in a game.
And creating technologies where you can firebomb an entire village indiscriminately and not see the consequences of your action. But I think this film engages with disenfranchisement of citizens within a representative democracy really well, right? Through the character of Tony Jr., as he arrives with his truck full of books for the people and campaigning to be their continued representative. But it has all this sort of money and power behind him, right? In terms of promotion within the political process and and his control of resources, right? Which I think is very relevant, not just to Brazil, but sort of globally in the political process.
Yeah, and even with him, at least bearing those books and that medication, it strikes you as a viewer. I mean, especially when Carmelita has her moment where she's explaining all this stuff, and then the teacher, the teacher and the doctor seem to control the dialogue and discussion, right? And he says, "All right, we're going to salvage the books that we can, and the other ones, we're going to do whatever with." But it's still one of those things of like, we don't want this shit. You're giving us all these outdated books, all these old books. We don't want them, but we're going to put them to use. We're not going to destroy them. And then Carmelita says the same thing with the medication. She's like, look, I'm telling you as a doctor, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. I don't want any of you taking this. But if you want it, it's right here. Right. And the trust that they have within their local community which is still one of those things that I look at this film, I'm like, damn it. I remember what it was like when people trusted doctors and teachers and scientists, where none of them went and touched that medication because she's like, this is what it will do to you. Right. Now, if you want to get high, you want to die, whatever. But we have the medication that we've typically gotten here. I've got the psychotropics here in case you need them. But just the way that they don't want to interact with Tony Jr. because they know he's a snake. Right. But there's nothing that they can do about it, which is really the remarkable thing. It's like, this is the situation that we're in. We're not accepting it, but we are dealing with it.
Yeah, it's a community, despite being sort of utopian and I don't know, but this sort of community ethos, it highly values free will, which is a really interesting way that this kind of plays that balance.
Well, something I forgot to mention earlier. There's this great interaction with the teacher and the students. When we first discovered that BACURAU is not on the map, and he's just it's like, no, this is. And for me, I got a little bit pulled away from the movie because I forgot it's supposed to be in the future because it looks like right now, right? And that's very telling because this could be right now. But the fact that they had all this technology, the cell phones, they had the smart board, they had all this stuff available to them, right? And Silverio Pereira had in one of his interviews talked about how one of the themes of the film is this idea of democratization of technology. And the idea that there are people out there that don't want you to have this, don't want you to access it, don't want you to use it. And what that does is it creates more division by not allowing people to have access to that stuff. But that teacher, when he's talking to the students and showing them all this stuff, and he's talking about their community, it's very refreshing, and it made me want to say, like, you know what, honey, I'm packing up all our shit, we're moving to some small town. But he asked this question. He's like, "Oh, we live in BACURAU. It's in this province of Brazil, and it's here. It's next to this lake and down this river." And so he's giving them a very in-depth geography lesson, right? Very active. The kids are very attentive to what he's doing. And he says, "Oh, we live in BACURAU. What are people from BACURAU called?" And one of the kids shouts out, "People." And the thing is, that could be a really good throwaway line, right? A really good throwaway line where you're like, "Oh, silly kid, you should be called BACURAUans or BACURANs or something," right? But the fact that it's not heavily challenged, it's just left there as for the viewer to think about, these are fucking people. Right. These are people. And the thing is, those hunters, those poachers, those assassins that show up, they don't want to see them as people. And because they happen to be what some people have defined as throwaway people or forgotten people, that it's real easy to dehumanize them, to create them and turn them into subhuman beings or people, or turn them into numbers where it's kind of like, they weren't on the map. There was no BACURAU here. What the hell are you talking about? That city doesn't exist. Right. To where, because they're identifying themselves as people, you can't see them as anything other than people.
Absolutely.
Well, and it really points out just how fucked up the people hunting them are.
Yeah, because they're savages, man.
Right.
I think that's also a line that works really well for foreign viewers, because not everybody is going to see them as equal. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I think that, like you said, it's a good throwaway line, but it's also one of those things that's there to hit your subconscious and make you go, "Hey, fucker, pay attention."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, easily.
One of my favorite moments in this film late is after the kind of massacre and as the village is cleaning up is really interesting, and they're sort of scrubbing the blood off of the floors and washing it out of the homes in the museum. There's a moment where there's a bloody handprint on the wall, and the museum kind of director goes, "No, leave that there," which I find is really interesting. This sort of like acknowledging the violence of your past, right, and not sort of erasing that from your own kind of narrative, right, of your history is so important.
Mm-hmm. It's such a beautiful museum moment as well, because you do want to keep an artifact. You want to keep the important things. And that is not just important, that is 100% where it happened, and it's legit history that's preserved. But you also can't leave the whole library just covered in dried blood.
Sure.
So you have to clean it. So this one's out of the way and yet very prominent. And it really sums up how bad it was, because a bloody handprint on the wall is hopefully not a normal day at the office. So even for a horror writer.
Right. It goes back to kind of that quote from Gleb Rocha where he says that like only a culture looking at itself can kind of rise above itself or what have you, but that we have to sort of look at ourselves and our own history and remember that past.
Especially when we look at our own culture, as far as American culture, and anybody who disagrees with me, feel free to reach me on Twitter as opposed to James, because, and that's not like a threat or anything. It just means that I'd be happy to have this conversation, because the way that we typically look at U.S. history is through rose-colored lenses, very rose-colored lenses. When the 1619 Project came out from the New York Times, there were people who were upset saying, like, why are we still talking about slavery? Why are we still talking about X, Y, and Z? Well, first, it was the 400th anniversary of the first slave ships arriving at the British colonies, which then became America. So it's the 400th year anniversary. Yeah. But then so much of the history surrounding Asian Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans, women, the LGBTQ plus community has been glossed over to where it's treated as, well, some shit happened. Where you have to take, and this is why I advocate for anybody who, can't afford college or doesn't have the time to go back or anything like that. I always advocate, reach out to anybody in your local community as far as your community colleges, universities, and ask any of those professors for reading. Because if anybody's going to turn you down and say, like, well, I'm not giving you any good readings, you got to take my class. Just reach out to somebody else on the email. Because we're all, and I'm speaking for myself, I'm more than willing if somebody contacts me and says, hey, I want to learn more about X. And if I don't know, I'm going to contact somebody and say, hey, what are some good readings to talk about this? Because what we're fed in K-12, and I'm specifically saying college, because what we're fed in K-12 is this really nice BS type of history that's taught that, yay, in 1919, women got the right to vote. But it doesn't say anything about the women that were beaten within an inch of their life or shot or sexually assaulted because they wanted the right to vote, or doesn't talk about, the end of the Civil War didn't mean peace. I mean, if anything, things got more violent at the local level. So what I have to say about this is when it comes to that self-reflection, I think it's very important, not just, and this film gives us a good chance to see how self-reflection is done well, but we can do it also with our actual histories, to determine where are the really messed up parts. And I mean messed up parts as far as within the archive, where things have been left out or things have been romanticized, to where we can look at it and say, like, that's not the way the story happened. And that's not the way the story should be told from now on, because all it does is it keeps confusing us as far as what happened, and makes heroes out of villains and villains out of heroes, depending on your perspective. I mean, for the longest time, to use a civil rights example, I went to high school in Georgia, and they taught Malcolm X and Dr. King as yin and yang. They taught them as polar, and that did the disservice in so many different ways to both their legacies, but then also with respect to the civil rights movement. And then unfortunately, it started pushing, or I should say it started pushing, it continued to push this idea of respectability where, yeah, of course, Dr. King won. He did it the right way, as opposed to, what Malcolm X was doing was when it was somehow inflammatory or ruffled the wrong feathers or whatever, but the man never did anything violent. And I think self-reflection is a good way, whether we're talking about a film, we're talking about history, or we're talking about our own selves, to realize, what's the right course of action? What exactly is the correct record? And exactly, how are we going to learn the most out of a situation? And how are we going to best learn those things so we can actually pass them on to the next generation so we can, undo a lot of that stuff?
There's the interesting feature of kind of resolving Michael's plotline. I'm curious what you guys think about him being imprisoned in this sort of underground bunker.
I want to back up really fast and look at Michael because, like a lot of people listening to this probably haven't seen it. So Michael is the one who runs this whole thing. He seems like he set it up with Tony Jr. and the corrupt politician, and Michael starts hunting his own people, like the people that he brought in to hunt the others. He doesn't view them any differently. And he just starts popping anybody he can. And apparently he awards himself points. I don't know if there's somebody above him, but but I find that in itself interesting because it becomes that analogy of I don't see color or I don't see a difference between this. It's just me. I'm above all of you. Right?
That's right. He's played by Udo Kier, who is a German actor. So we also think about his Germanness potentially in all of this. And he hunts differently than the other ones, right? He doesn't like to be in the town. He likes to have a sniper rifle and a silencer and sort of pick people off from afar.
Yeah, they even call him out for cheating. They're like, you're cheating. I'm glad you brought up the Nazi point, James.
Yeah.
That stood out to me. But go ahead, because I've got something on that one.
Hang on. Go back really fast. Repeat what you were saying about the cheating, because I was talking over that.
No. I was going to say that the other hunters even call him out because they're like, Michael, are you using a silencer? That's basically saying like you're cheating by doing that. As if rules and honor matter to these people.
Absolutely. They've definitely created a fiction of like an honorable war, right? This idea of like, well, we don't kill children. We don't do, such and such. I'm very like curious about his depiction. I mean, the irony of that statement when they call him a Nazi, right, is that they're all Nazis.
They're literally exterminating an entire population.
Right. They're all fascists.
I love that, though, because it's such line drawing. It's, I'm here because God gave me this chance to purge it from my system, and you're a sick weirdo who likes to kill people. And each one of them has these lines. You have the guy that shoots the child, and then he's like, oh, I couldn't tell. It was dark. And it's like, you couldn't tell he was 3 feet tall? Like, who did you think you were shooting is my question. But so they get into this point where Terry calls him a Nazi and Michael responds so violently to it, like not physically violently, but he gets very in his face and he's very, the next time you want to insult somebody, think about what the fuck you're saying and come up with some good insults.
Right.
You think I'm a Nazi just because I'm German. And no, we think you're a Nazi because you're running this thing to kill a whole population. That's why we think you're a Nazi. But I love that ability to just justify what each person is doing.
I was going to say, as far as his response to being called a Nazi, he then says, "I've been a citizen for 40 years." Or I said, "How old are you?" And he says, "Oh, well, I've lived in America for X amount of years. I'm more American than you." Because all that makes me think of, in fact, I think I thought about it when I paused the movie at that point, was this post 9/11 world. Like, right after 9/11, it was like, oh, man, you better wear some red, white, and blue. You better show everybody how American you are. And how that became so corrupted to where even now in this past year, there's still that idea of there are some things that you're not going to wear. It even became a joke on Black Twitter, like last 4th of July, where it was, or it might have been a couple 4th of Julys before, but it was basically saying like, I don't trust any black person that wears stars and, the stars and stripes clothing. And it was just this whole idea of like, if you're wearing that shit, I mean, especially since 2016, I don't know if I can trust you. You might be like Candace Owens or Kanye or Stacey Dash or somebody. But no, when he has that whole moment of I'm more American than you, there then becomes another leveling of identity. Like it's not even an issue of, the us versus the other. It's now a different levels within our camp where you don't see those levels with the people of BACURAU. There is no class distinction there. It seems as though, and this is from my viewing of it and then thinking about it, writing some notes and looking at some interviews, it seems as though BACURAU is the most democratically associated place in Brazil, at least, right? Because everybody has their role, everybody has their function, no one is on top of anybody else. I mean, the only time you're seen as an authority is when it is something that pertains to your area.
Yeah, you're a doctor.
Yeah. So I need medical advice. I'm not going down to Tim. I'm going to Carmelita. I need to read. I'm not going to, the guy with the cool sound system on the back of the truck. I'm going to go here. So you see how they all respect each other and have mutual respect for the town. And it almost seems like that the town itself is the thing that is binding everybody together to understand this is how we function. We are all part of one thing, right? We're all part of one community. And the thing that makes us a good community is for us to actually work together.
Here's what I find really interesting about this ending for Michael is, so in the film, he becomes imprisoned in this underground bunker, and then they pour dirt back over him. And there's a couple of things that happen. One is that one of the elder women from the village looks at him and says, I think he could have been a good person once, which is really interesting. Then they all kind of take the psychotropic drug and put him in the underground bin. There's a circularity to this, given that the film opens with a funeral. Right? And here they are all collected around this grave again as they bury this man. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around what that's doing.
All right. So my take on it is this is white privilege at its best. Okay.
Okay.
Michael never believes he's in trouble.
Okay.
He's like, Tony will get me out of this. And he's walking through and he's like, oh, what are you guys going to do to me? Whatever, And maybe he's a little scared, but he doesn't come off as having that same fear that he's going to be killed. He didn't see what happened to Terry. He didn't, everything he's seen, somebody gets shot fast. So if you shoot me fast, I'm dead. Who cares, right? And I feel like this is very reminiscent to me of just white privilege theory that you'll be saved and you're special somehow and the rules don't apply to you. And he walks through and Tony arrives and he's just like, Tony, get me out of this, and then Tony is just like, yeah, I've never met this guy before in my life. Never heard of him. I don't know where I was going with that. But I take cheap shots. What can I say? But, Tony's just like, no, I wasn't involved in that because Tony's saving himself. And that's the exact problem with their whole side, right? Their whole side is always only looking out for themselves. And so then you get to this burial and number one, he dies alone eventually because he's not dying that second. But he's put into this underground little cage thing, and then they bury him. But the community still comes together for it.
Right.
And the community still has that air of life is sacred and every life matters, even our enemy. And they put him in there because they have to. He has to be punished. He's a threat. You can't leave him out there. And he's the reason that a lot of your family and friends are dead. And so I really took from this that he dies alone while completely surrounded by people who were there but didn't give a shit about him. They just care about the sacredness of life and death.
I guess why not shoot him like everyone else?
I think when it comes down to, because everyone else was killed while engaging in violence, or at least engaging in the act of violence towards people of BACURAU, right? So whether it was the couple that was out by the old man's house,
right?
And of course the lady, she dies in the clinic, or people within the town, whether it was Michael shooting them or townspeople shooting him, it was active conflict. But I think because they caught him in the act, one of the villagers, walks up behind him and puts a gun to his head. It was, I think it was an issue of showing mercy by not doing that, but also at least getting some closure in trying to understand why they were there and why they were doing this. And also, at least theatrically, it helps expose Tony Jr.
right.
In more ways than one, obviously.
Right. Who we should say gets sent out of town on a donkey.
I laughed so hard at that scene because I think one of them made it. And again, I might be thinking about my wife saying this, but the whole idea that they were more concerned with the donkey than with Tony Jr.
Right.
I laughed so hard because it was kind of like, that's exactly what you should do to him. You should send him through all these cacti and naked and let him ride. And the donkey knows his way home. He'll be back.
Yeah, I think that actually backs up my theory about why they bury him instead of shooting him. Because they're not about making that choice. It's, if God wants you out of this, I guess, I don't know that they're saying God, but you know what I'm saying. If you can get out of this, okay, but you probably won't, but I'm not the one pulling the trigger.
Right.
Interesting. I mean, I have a different read on this because I definitely think it's murder. I don't think there's any chance that they put this big iron gate on top of him and cover it with dirt that he's going to escape. And I think they know that. But
no, I agree with that. I just think it's the community doing it versus me pulling the trigger.
Right. And I think that's what it's about too, right? It's about this sort of like that everyone in the town has participated in this, that they've all dumped, a shovel full of dirt onto this grave, and it becomes the final like death is one that they've done as a community.
Right.
Yeah, I love that.
And what I mean by murder is, as far as like actively shooting that person, actively cutting their head off, anything like that. I mean, yeah, it's still going to be murder, but as far as their viewpoint on his death, it's not going to be the same as if we just stood him up against a wall and decided to pull, we picked one person to pull the trigger, and then you have to deal with, I did it as opposed to I was defending myself.
Right,
but when Michael's put in that pit, in that jail cell, he makes that comment where he said, "This is only the beginning," which one is a very, very bold thing to say when these people are still debating whether or not they're going to kill you. It's a very bold thing to say. You have no power. Your hands are bound. You're put into this cell underground. You're buried in there. And that's your perspective as you're going in. I immediately thought back to the conversation that all these people were having early in the film, which was, nobody knows we're here. And I just thought to myself, like, how's it only the beginning? No one knows that you're there. Tony Jr. has set this up. Tony Jr. himself, he's not going to have this moment where he can go and brag to somebody else and tell people what happened and what he was involved in. I think this is only the beginning as with respect to stuff like this happening to other people. I don't think...
I disagree. I mean, there will always be another Tony Jr., right? Like...
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I said Tony. I meant Michael. I mean, as far as like Michael having that viewpoint of, we're going to come back. But I'm like, how? Tony...
but no, I read it as like...
They want him to learn his lesson, but I don't think it...
But this isn't the end of them being under threat by, colonialist forces, right? Like that's how I read it. Like, there will always be another Tony Jr. There will always be some form of Michael, trying to annihilate this community. And that
there will always be people like me.
Yeah, and that they'll always have to fight, right?
I think, because I think we had this conversation before about post-colonialism. And I think that's the great thing about it is you have an independence period, you have your post-colonial, and in some cases you have neo-colonialism, right? But I think the great thing that this film demonstrates is, and especially with your point, is that this this is not a cycle that comes to an end. It just changes shape.
Yeah.
So maybe, what's coming isn't the same method of oppression that Michael, or oppression and violence that Michael and his crew were bringing. It might be something else like, well, screw it. We're just going to cut off the water. We're going to find some other way, which has taken place in Brazil. And Brazil's not alone in this. Where it's, there are these indigenous people that are living near this river where we want to build a dam. Yeah. And what you have is some of these companies have sent people out to go and kill members of those indigenous communities or farmers when there was land that some of these companies wanted. And it's just some brutal stuff that has taken place in some of the more remote parts of Brazil, because these people, just like the people in BACURAU, they're seen as disposable people or forgotten people, where it's like, well, you're not living in Rio, so why the fuck are you living in the jungle? You should live out here. If you live out there, I mean, you got all types of things that can attack you. Why not let them have the river so they can make a dam and provide electricity, as opposed to, let's let you live in peace out there, and maybe we can come up with some arrangement where we get to use the water or build a dam or something. But it's all honesty, it's gotten worse under people like Bolsonaro, where I'm glad that people like Silveira Pereira actually exist and other activists exist, because they've been outspoken against him, previous administrations, about their abuses of power, the relationships they have with corporate entities to take away water, take away land, take away rights, things like that. So I think films like this speak to issues that are within their own country, but it also speaks to universal issues of oppression in other nations, like, even in the United States, when you're talking about water in Flint, or land being reclaimed, or I think it was Great Bears National Park, National Monument. So much land was taken again from indigenous people for things like mining and oil production.
Absolutely.
Without any say.
So when we started this, we kind of talked a little bit about how the town is more of a character than any of the characters in the film are. We don't get full character arcs. Don, I know you had a lot to say about this, so do you want to walk me through it?
There's more emphasis that's placed on the town than there is on any individual. I mean, the only time that individuals focus in on are Lunga, Carmelita, because it's her funeral, which again, aesthetically, and especially with the history of Brazil has with media, whether it's film, magazines, television, whatever, has been this I guess this aversion to showing darker skinned people as beautiful. And the thing is, the people in this film are what you would run into in any town in Brazil. I mean, as far as the diversity of color, the body shapes, the love of their bodies, as far as like, not this idea of I mean, which, you're still going to have people who are hung up and have different body issues, right? But it's not that programming as far as the body issues of you have to look like this to be seen as beautiful. But just the idea that, just the fact that near the end, we actually see Carmelita's spirit, which seems to be like at one with the town, because she just seems very stoic, very peaceful. And just this idea that there's this beautiful dark-skinned Brazilian woman at the end of the film that's basically, serving as the consciousness, serving as the soul of the city. But then you see so many different colored people, different colors of people in this film that make you appreciate that this film, as you said before, is doing a lot of self-reflection. And they're projecting the image that is more real of what Brazil is than I would say we got with, things like the opening ceremonies of the Olympics. Not saying anything bad about it, but I mean, as far as like, that was the first time that a lot of people were like, oh my God, there are black people in Brazil. There are dark-skinned people in Brazil. And what's really interesting about this, and before I forget, is that people in Brazil can be different colors, but they see themselves as the same color. I mean, different shades of brown. Like, you can go from like almond skin to like just dark black skin, right? But they will see themselves as the same racial classification. And that's what I see with this town is whether we're talking about the doctor who's played by Sonia Braga, or we're talking about the teacher or Carmelita, you have all these people that see themselves as the same people, as opposed to, you know, having all this division, which you then see with the outsiders, where they have all these divisions, all these walls that they're putting up, whereas you don't see any walls for the people of BACURAU, except for when it comes to outsiders that seek to do damage to them or change them.
So I don't have anything left in my notes, and I know you guys don't either. So this is normally the part where we jump to if people liked this, other films you would suggest that they watch. And I'm just going to tell you right now, I have absolutely no idea. So there's my list.
Really? James, that surprises me.
I grew up white in Nebraska. No, it's probably honestly that I haven't really slept in the last 2 days. But anyway, so Don, I'm sure you'll make up for it for me. So we'll pretend half of yours are mine. Do you want to go first? Because I kind of blindsided
please.
Dr. Scahill with this.
Oh yeah. Don, do you have any?
I've got several, so I'll go with a few. Okay. I'm surprised James did not say the Belko experiment. Let's see. The Purge. The Purge, obviously. Any of the Purge films. The Hunt. Hostel is one that I wrote down. And I wouldn't say Hostel 2, because Hostel 2 was nowhere near as good as the first one. But then
that's funny. I hate Hostel. I find it so homophobic.
I'm not saying it was a great movie.
Oh, okay.
I'm just saying the second one was so much worse.
Oh yeah.
I was intrigued with the premise of it, but then I was kind of like, oh, this is gore. This is full on gore. Parasite.
If I were to kind of recommend some Latin American films in the horror genre, there's a really great one out of Mexico called Tigers Are Not Afraid.
Yes.
Which also is not getting enough press and publicity that I think people should check out. A really great one, I believe it's Argentina, called Terrified. Okay. That's a really interesting version of the haunted house film. It's more like a haunted neighborhood, but each house seems to have a haunting that corresponds to American cinema. And I read it as Argentinian cinema being haunted by the expectations of American cinema. Again, me thinking about all films are about film. Within this sort of genre, you mentioned a couple of them that definitely correspond. The one I think is pretty fantastic is called Get Duked. And it's a Scottish film. It's on Amazon Prime. And it is sort of The Purge or Hostel by way of a stoner comedy. And it's three delinquent Scottish youths who get sent out to the countryside for a sort of nature excursion that will kind of improve their character. But it's really just a place for British royalty to hunt them. Very funny. Eddie Izzard is the villain. If you know him,
okay.
I don't know why this film isn't more popular, because it's honestly one of the funniest films I've seen in the last 5 or 10 years. So nice. That's what I would recommend.
Yeah, I mean, Parasite made me kind of think, if you're just going like the rich suck and don't view anybody else as good, you know, I mean, there's Ready or Not, which I can never say enough nice things about. Parasite, of course. I mean, there's so many. Like, that's like the recurring theme right now. Like, we're really pushing this structure that the underdog needs to start fighting back. Another interesting thing I watched where it was about the rich sucking. It's called The News. The News, yeah. And it's on every channel. It's at 6:00 at night. It's been really interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know that I suggest it. It's it's not well written. Things don't make a lot of sense sometimes.
There's a really interesting one coming out soon called The Man Who Sold His Skin. Do you know this one?
I do not.
It's a joint production between Tunisia and I believe France, but it is a man who's down on his luck who basically sells his back to a famous artist to tattoo him, and he essentially becomes a commodity to be bought and sold on the market.
I did forget a couple of movies.
Half of them are mine.
No, there was, oh gosh, I think it was a Spanish language film from Spain. I believe it was called Veronica. It was about a teenage girl who was being possessed, which it was really well done. And of course, I hate when movies say this is the scariest movie of the year, because then you turn off a lot of people who are looking for a scary movie. But the movie was so well done. It didn't need the hype behind it to talk about what a scary movie it was. A couple of history-related films, I would say, definitely work for people. If you're looking for something Latin American dealing with politics, The Official Story is like a gold standard movie when it comes to understanding political corruption in Argentina right after the Dirty War of the late 70s, early 80s, and how children were taken away from women. There are a couple other films that deal with situations in Brazil. I mean, there's always City of God, which would be a good one to get into, where you talk about, the poor and what they have to deal with in the favelas. But those would be two more I would add. And of course, this movie is my gold standard for Latin American horror right now.
Yeah, awesome.
This is the top. And again, thank you for recommending this film, because I would have completely missed it.
Good. I'm happy to.
Yeah, I literally hadn't even heard of it, so it wasn't anywhere near my radar, let alone on it. But no, I mean, this is, like I said, my second favorite thing I've seen so far this year, and I'm just so blown away by everything we talked about, but like the genre mixing and just subverting expectations with every single one. I would like this film to be longer. Like I was going to say I want to live in BACURAU. That is not true. I want to watch this world more. And I could totally use another, 40 minutes of this.
I'm telling you right now, I could live there. I would love to. A movie like, I'm sorry, not a movie, a town like that where everybody has their purpose. They come together, people eat, people are taken care of. I mean, could you imagine a situation that's like that?
No, I grew up in Nebraska. Anyway, I couldn't resist. I said it too many times. Anyway, let's bring it back to you. So, Dr. Scahill, do you want to tell us one more time where people can find your books or contact you online or follow you in an alley or whatever you want to go for? The boundaries are yours to choose.
Preferably not the last. I'll take a stalker letter. I'm going to stop at that. So you can find me online. I have a website. It is AD as in David Scahill, SCAHILL.com. And on Twitter, where my tag is Andrew Scahill.
Very cool. All right. So I think that wraps it up for this week. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. I really had a great time. Happy to come back anytime you need somebody.
Definitely. You're more than welcome to.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I told you I'm quitting. You have to be back next week.
Got to clear my schedule.
All right. So as always, I am James Sabata.
And I am Don Guillory.
And some of us will see you here next week at thenecronama.com.